Good morning and welcome to the 25th meeting of the committee in 2019. I'd like to remind members and the public to turn off mobile phones, and any members using electronic devices to access committee papers should please ensure that they are turned to silent. Our first item on the agenda today is the committee's continued inquiry into the progress of the Article 50 withdrawal negotiations. And from the Scottish Government, I'd like to welcome to the meeting Michael Russell, the Cabinet Secretary for Government Business and Constitutional Relations, Mr David Barnes, Head of EU Exit Strategy and Negotiations with the Scottish Government, and Mr Luke McBratney, Head of the EU Exit Legislation Team at the Scottish Government. And I'd like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. I'll be very brief. I had the opportunity to address the current issues of the revised withdrawal agreement and political declaration yesterday in the Chamber. We published a document yesterday which gives the comparisons we think are important, so I'd be very happy to answer questions on them.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very brief. Thank you very much. As you say, you did make an opening statement to Parliament yesterday, so I wanted to focus very specifically on one aspect of the withdrawal agreement bill, which of course may or may not come to fruition, and that is the issue of citizens' rights. Our committee advisor, Dr Eve Hepburn, has identified a number of areas in the withdrawal agreement bill that could pose problems for EU citizens, notably the risks of deportation, the uncertainty and reduced rights of pre-settled status citizens. So I wondered if you would be able to share the Scottish Government's view on how citizens' rights have been addressed in the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, and what concerns you may still have.
Well, we do have very considerable concerns still about the issue of citizens' rights, and I addressed some of them in what I said yesterday. I think there is the sort of macro impact, which is that the general debate around this is hostile and off-putting to EU citizens particularly, who either live here presently or who would wish to come here. And I think as a result, the damage of ending freedom of movement, and there will be very substantial damage to the Scottish economy, let alone the health of Scottish society in ending freedom of movement, will be considerable. Now, the text in this does offer protection to EU citizens, but it is not unilateral, and that has been one of the concerns that we've had for a considerable period of time. In fact, I think since the beginning of this, and I think I have mentioned this in evidence here before, we have felt that what should happen is there should be a unilateral declaration of EU citizens' rights, and the legislation should be put into effect no matter the conclusions and the outcomes of this process, and that would provide a degree of certainty. We are concerned about the comparatively low level of take-up of settled status. We're concerned about the issues around pre-settled status. And then overall, this is a difficult and very worrying time for EU citizens who live in Scotland. As individual MSPs, I'm sure all of us have held events or been involved in events that have tried to assist EU citizens. And I think all of us will therefore know that there is a very considerable degree of angst and upset in this. And the Scottish Government, as a whole, wants to do everything it can to help. But it cannot, of course, grant citizenship. And that is the key thing which people wish.
Of course, yes, and it's certainly the case, I know from my own constituency caseload, that there is a great deal of anxiety amongst EU citizens in the south of Scotland about their future. You mentioned the issue of settled status and the number of EU citizens registering for settled status. The Home Office have released records showing that the proportion of EU nationals registering for status through the settlement scheme is significantly lower in Scotland. Apparently it's about 25% of EU nationals in Scotland have registered, compared to an UK average about 50%. Have you got any insight into why that might be?
It's very difficult to say. There's been a lot of talk and thinking about this, but it's difficult to say. Some of it might reflect the temporary nature of people who come and who go, particularly those who work in agriculture, and that therefore there may be a feeling amongst them that they don't need or wish this. They're wrong about that, but there is that feeling. It could also be people's incredulity that this is required of them, and a feeling that as Scotland is different, then they don't need to do so. Now, I've been very clear, and the government's been very clear, and I would want to be clear again here today. The Scottish Government's advice to EU nationals here is to apply for settled status. We don't like that. I think it's offensive that people are being asked to do so, particularly people who've lived in this country for a very long period of time. I have a number of constituents I've met who've been in Scotland for 20, 30, one of them almost 40 years, and being asked to do this is very wounding and offensive to them. But we advise people to do that. And indeed, if they do not do so and they do not observe the law, then problems can occur for them. So we will continue to do so. There may be other reasons, but those are the reasons we're thinking of at the moment.
Right. Obviously, the UK government, it's only the UK government under the law that can enshrine is it residency rights. But is there anything that the Scottish Government could do to enshrine other rights, such as the rights to health care or other areas of devolved competence that might give EU citizens more reassurance?
And those are guaranteed. I mean, there is no question that those will continue to be in existence, and we will honour those to the full and willingly honour those to the full. I suppose there is a central problem in this. It would be wrong of us to say to people that we can do things that we can't do. And the key issue is residency and the continued right of residency. And the Scottish Government cannot yet, I have to say. I look forward to the day when we can, but the Scottish Government cannot yet provide those to individual citizens. Now, we will do everything we can to help those citizens. I continue to do so in every case that I can do so. And we would want to do more. But I don't want to say to people, you know, don't worry about it, we can sort this, right? If people, however, do register, have settled status, they have legal rights, and I have made it very clear we will do everything in our power to defend people who have those legal rights, because they should not be threatened in any way. But if people don't apply for settled status, then it becomes much more difficult.
Yes, and of course the so-called transition period, if this withdrawal agreement was to go through, is really very short. It's to the end of 2020. So what do you think the implications of that short transition period are for any EU citizens who have failed to register in that period?
Well, the cut-off date cannot be, I think, more than 6 months after the end of the transition period. I think I'm right in saying that. But of course, the end of the transition period is presently given as the end of 2020. So that cut-off period would be into 2021. But there's no detail about how that will presently operate. I think there is also a great insecurity about that transition period. I think anybody who reads this documentation and looks at the politics around it will quickly come to the conclusion that it is at least a possibility, and some of us would think quite a likelihood, that the UK government will be wanting to leave at the end of 2020, whether or not they have finished the most complex piece of negotiation they will ever have been involved in or not. And in those circumstances, that becomes a real pressure. But, the simple advice is register, make sure you have settled status. If you run into difficulties for that, there is advice available. The Scottish Government is supporting Citizens Advice Bureau in providing, face-to-face advice and telephone advice. Individual MSPs can signpost to that advice and can offer help. Do it, make sure you get settled status, and then in those circumstances, much more can be done to help and protect you, should anything then happen.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and I'll pass on to Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. To all intents and purposes, the withdrawal bill is currently paused or shelved, and we're facing a general election, which nobody knows the outcome of following that. However, the statement yesterday, we did have a statement just before recess from the Deputy First Minister around no-deal planning. And in that statement, John Swinney committed to a poverty mitigation fund. The document that was published yesterday of the assessment of the current withdrawal agreement, what I've managed to read of it since yesterday, it seems quite economy-focused. So it does talk about how much the economy would lose per individual, 1,600, but it is more about trade and about the economic impact. Does the government intend to look at the kind of mitigation measures, such as the Poverty Mitigation Fund? It was a commitment to the no deal, but is there, because of the deal in front of us, the government clearly have concerns about, is there any plans to bring similar proposals that would be more directed at the social issues around the deal?
It is a very good question. These things have to be dealt with sequentially. We dealt with no deal in enormous detail and continue to do so. I mean, the no deal preparations, I suppose you would say, are paused again, but they've certainly not gone away. You know, we've had no deal preparations up until March, April. They were paused. Then we went back into no deal preparations. Vast sums of money being spent, and money being spent that has not been recouped from the UK, and the UK's attitude to this has not been helpful. Now they're paused again, but we would need to be aware that they could kick in at any time, and we'll run them forward. With this one, this is an initial analysis of the deal. We've given the analysis of what we think the key issues are in here. We will now, of course, look at the implementation of the deal. Were it to happen, and let's remember, there is an election period. I know that the presiding officer doesn't want us to talk about it, so I won't say to vote for anybody. But, there is an election period, and in that election period, things can change. But, if the current withdrawal bill was to go through the House of Commons, say, in January, and we were to leave at the end of January, then quite clearly we would want to have in place our understanding of how everybody in Scotland is affected by that, and that would certainly include the most vulnerable. One of the things we did do, both in the run-up to March, April, and then in the recent run-up, was to be very mindful of the fact that whatever happens, the poorest and most vulnerable in society are going to be worst affected, both by Brexit, which is a recipe for disaster, but also by the slowdown and weakening of the economy, which will happen as a result of Brexit, of which there is no doubt.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask about the political declaration, which would take us through the transition period if the bill is passed? The bill deals with three areas: the EU citizens' rights and the financial settlement and the Northern Ireland situation, and everything else is to be put into the political declaration. Do you want to give some comments on what you views on the current political declaration and say whether the Scottish Government have had, I think I know the answer to this, but have the Scottish Government had any involvement in discussions with the UK Government about what should be in there?
I made the point yesterday, and it's a very telling point. I just want to make it again. Of the 500 pages, not a single paragraph, not a single line was cleared by the devolved administrations or agreed to by the devolved administrations before it was agreed between the UK and the EU. And that's the reality of the situation. So in terms of political direction, the answer is no. I mean, there's been no agreement to it. It is always presented as a fait accompli and say we've taken into account your interests without any evidence, in fact, lots of evidence to the contrary. The political declaration, of course, is in one sense a wish list. It is a set of aspirations of what they hope the relationship would be. It has no legal force. However, the legal force does apply to the fact that it is meant to be nothing with that is meant to be within the final agreement. In other words, what is in that is meant to guide and lay down the tracks for what the final agreement will be. So you've got to look at that and say that gives you the shape of the likely agreement. And it's a very unambitious trading agreement, which broadly similar to Canada, but not actually as advantageous to the UK as a Canadian agreement is to Canada itself. It also makes clear that the issue of the level playing field, which always sounds very technical, but is absolutely crucial to what happens next. The level playing field has gone from the withdrawal agreement into the political declaration. And the level playing field, therefore, is an aspiration to work in that way, not a commitment to work in that way, not a binding commitment to work in that way. And I think there's a lot of expectation that in workers' rights, employment rights, environmental protections, and in other areas, there will be a desire to reduce any commitment for these. Now, a desire on the UK's side to reduce that, not a desire on the EU side, and that's been absolutely clear. I mean, nobody could be in any doubt from the language. Mr. Barnier is saying, no tariffs, no quotas, no dumping. Something that underlines, in the way that it was said, that the UK will not be, if I may use this phrase, able to have its cake and eat it, and there will have to be a level playing field. And if there isn't a level playing field, there will be no agreement. And there certainly won't be an agreement, even of the nature of the Canadian one. If you look at services, for example, the aspiration, in the political declaration on services is exceptionally unambitious. It is in actual fact an alignment, no more. And in those circumstances, the very considerable export of services that takes place within the present arrangements simply won't happen.
And finally, a follow-on from the convener's questions around the transition period, which, as you said, is due to end in 2020. Do you think a political what do you think of those timescales? Do you have concerns about the shortness of the timescales and whether the trade agreement that needs to be done can be finalised within that period?
I do not believe it is possible to finalise a trading agreement of any description between now and the end of 2020. Moreover, if you look at the detail of this, any extension of that period has to be decided on by July. So let us, for the sake of argument, say if we leave the EU at the end of January, there will be simply 5 months to assess what progress has been made and what needs to be done. Now, if you look at the history of the last three and a bit years, this was meant to be the easy part, and it's been extraordinarily difficult. Where we are now is we're going into an element of complexity far greater than what we have seen. And we're also doing it with to be blunt, the world's best negotiators. And one of the real lessons of this is that, the EU is immensely skilled in trade negotiation. It is, the Americans essentially and the EU are the two most skilled trade negotiation countries or blocs in the world. And in these circumstances, I do not believe that the UK can come to an agreement. Now, it could extend, though the bill itself is difficult on that. They can extend, but presently the Commons can't extend, only the government can extend. That may change, that might be a change to the bill. But in all these circumstances, I think we're in for another rough ride if the UK leaves. And of course, that gives the lie to the get Brexit done. That is a ludicrous statement, absolutely ludicrous statement, because we will be in the same or deeper mess this time next year than, because of the situation we're in.
Okay. Thank you very much. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Lots of speculation over the last month or so that there was no real meaningful negotiation taking place between the UK government and the EU. And Member States made it quite clear that they didn't believe that the agreement could be reopened and could be renegotiated in any way. But that did seem to change. Even Ireland has signed up to the new agreements along with Germany and France, who were making some strong voices about where they were. So we now have that new situation. And we've already just touched on the sort of transition periods that are taking place and the new political declaration. So times are, there's no question that the timescale is tight. But can I ask about the meaningful negotiations? You've made it abundantly clear that the Scottish Government was not involved in any part of these meaningful negotiations. And if you were a part of that meaningful negotiations, you would have put forward the case for the Scottish Government. I'm perplexed by some of that because I believe that you have and we have the rights to do that. There's no question about that. But it's how that is going to be managed going forward. We are where we are. Yes, we're in an election campaign situation and things may change. We don't know the outcome of any of it, but we do know the outcome of where we are at present. So it would be quite good to get an idea of what you think about where we are and what that could actually impart.
Yeah, there are two important questions. Can I separate those two questions out? The first of which is about the negotiation process and what can be achieved within that. And it is sort of predicated on Boris Johnson, the master negotiator, which is something I'd like to demolish in a moment. And the second question is, how would the devolved administration, let's say, be involved in negotiations? The second one is very significant at this present moment. I'll come back to it. On the first one, it is always possible to get a change if you capitulate. And that's what you can do. And what has happened on the backstop is become the front stop. That is what has taken place. Now, I did say to a very senior UK government minister the day after it was agreed, who was lauding the fact that Boris Johnson had done this and the EU was enthusiastic about it. I said a big element in this is they've just had a sigh of relief because they've managed to persuade Boris Johnson to continue with the backstop, in actual fact to make it even more demanding than it was. And their sigh of relief is now they think they might get rid of him. And frankly, there is such an exhaustion in the EU about this process. They want to move on, that they were willing to make some very small concessions, in my view, and for him to make some very big concessions just to get it over with. And it's still not over with. So you could actually say, rather than Boris Johnson being a master negotiator, even his capitulation did not produce the result that he wanted. But anyway, you and I are not going to agree on that. But, I don't believe there was a master negotiator at work, quite the reverse. On the other one, I think we might be closer to agreement, because I'm glad you recognise the right of the devolved administrations to be involved. This has been a really big issue in the JMC for the last 2 years. And the issue really is, what is the relationship between the parts of these islands? And that is the intergovernmental review process. This was accepted almost 2 years ago now by the then Prime Minister, that there should be an intergovernmental review, that we should look at it. The thesis is, and you've heard me say this before, but the Welsh have said this too, that Brexit has been too heavy for devolution to bear, and there needs to be a change. A lot of proposals on the table. Mark Drakeford and I both made fairly detailed lectures to the Institute for Government. The Welsh have published on it. We will publish on it in the appropriate time, but what we publish will broadly reflect what I said to the Institute for Government earlier this year. We've had enormous difficulty getting the UK to the table on this. And the UK recently, the Johnson government, has added an extra dimension to it. We had an agreement with the previous government at the British Irish Council in June in Manchester. In the margins of that, we had a JMC meeting, and we agreed finally a timetable by which, by the end of September, we would have the initial outline of what we thought should happen, and that this should be finished by the end of the year. That's not going to happen. We haven't had the initial outline. We've still not seen anything, and we're now about to go into November. And actually, there is, in my view, no point in having that conversation in November, because the election will take precedence, and what will happen in this will be guided by what happens in the election. But there is a potential solution to this, which is to recognise that the detailed negotiations will involve devolved competences. You could theoretically argue that the withdrawal agreement and the political direction don't. I disagree with that. But you could theoretically argue that that was entirely covered by the international relations reservation. I think the fact that it had to seek a legislative consent for the withdrawal agreement bill rather gives the lie to that. But that's in the past. Undoubtedly, what will happen now is that negotiations will take place on devolved competences. And you've then got a model that you might want to apply. And the really interesting thing in this is that the model is being interpreted in two different ways. The model, I would say, would be the CETA Treaty. Now, in Canada, the CETA Treaty was negotiated with the EU with the provinces in the room, because many of the elements within the CETA Treaty were being dealt with in that negotiation. So the provinces were in the room for the simple reason that it meant that they could agree on those matters and they would be binding. Now, that's the lesson of the CETA Treaty that the UK government should take. There should be an engagement with the devolved administrations who are part of that process and can make decisions about what is done on the devolved competences, which is, there's no hierarchy of governments. There's a hierarchy of parliaments. There are things that are only ours. Regrettably, the UK government has taken another lesson from the CETA Treaty, which is what happened with the Flemish Parliament, which at the very end of the CETA process, if you remember, almost blocked it because of reservations. And they don't want the devolved administrations to go anywhere near the negotiations, because that's what they're afraid of. Now, unless there is a linkage between the intergovernmental review and that process of agreeing on what happens in the next stage, then we are going to simply have a repetition of where we are, and that will be a waste of everybody's time. But so far, there is not the slightest sign that they recognise that. And in fact, I can tell you that the latest proposal for the UK, from the UK government on these matters, which was made at the JMC 2 weeks ago, I think almost 3 weeks ago, so 3 weeks ago today actually, was rejected out of hand by both Wales and Scotland. It regressed from where we thought we had got to in terms of an agreement. So at the present moment, that is very far away from resolution.
There has to be a role for the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government in this process. Without that, there is no real progress, and we will end up continually having a war of words or a war of committees with one another about what should take place, what might take place. And without that stability in the process, it breaks down, and it continues to break down. And I am, for one, I regret that process is where we are, because there has to be that meaningful negotiation, and there has to be that discussion on a level playing field to some extent, so that we can ensure that the views and the opinions from this Parliament are being taken into account.
I'm very glad to hear that. I do hope you are in regular dialogue with Michael Gove and others to tell them that, because it's extremely important. You know, I would go a step further to say that where there are devolved competencies, the decision on those devolved competencies must be made by the devolved administrations, not by anybody else. But actually, the view you espouse, which is very welcome, is actually held very widely. Let me, with your permission, Convener, quote Philip Rycroft, a former Scottish senior civil servant, and of course, up until March, was the permanent secretary of DEXU. And he, in giving evidence to the House of Commons this week, said, talked about the lack of thinking about future relationship, but then said, the current Prime Minister Boris Johnson would also have a greater chance of succeeding if he involves the devolved administrations early in discussions around the UK's position and develops a common negotiated position that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland can promote. So there's a very widespread view that we need a new structure. Whatever your views are on independence or whatever, you need a new structure to cope with any period of negotiation if that were to come about. Regrettably, the only people who don't share that are the same people who've done nothing to move forward the intergovernmental review. That is the UK government, and without them it can't move.
Thank you. Mike Grumbles.
Cabinet Secretary, I know you've been busy preparing for the worst with Brexit, and quite rightly so. But my question takes us off in a different direction, because I'm interested to hear your comments, and particularly also perhaps Luke McBrathney, about in Westminster, when it gets the royal assent, the election bill gets the royal assent today, hopefully, then all legislation falls. The withdrawal bill falls, it doesn't exist, it's gone. And the people of our United Kingdom on December the 12th have the opportunity to choose a parliament and to choose, therefore, a government that takes us entirely in a different direction. So, as far as Westminster is concerned, there's no legislation going through. What are the implications for that, for all the subordinate legislation that is coming through all the committees at the moment? We had this at my committee yesterday, in the Rural Committee, because what is the point of pursuing all of this when there's nothing happening in Westminster? And we actually, being the eternal optimist as I am as a Liberal Democrat, there may be a completely different change of direction.
It's a really good question. Can I ask Luke to address it, and then I'll follow up what Luke has said. Luke is the real expert on the minutiae of legislation.
The current legislative project being coordinated between governments and parliaments is about providing for continuity of law on the point of exit from the EU. That's under the EU Withdrawal Act. And that project is required no matter what the date that we might be leaving the EU for. Obviously, we've recently prepared legislation for the possibility of leaving in March. Then again, some adjustments have been required for leaving in October. Further adjustments inevitably will be required if the date of exit changes to the end of January. But the background to that work, no matter the date, is the possibility of a no-deal exit, which is the present position that would take place in the absence of a withdrawal agreement being approved and given effect into law. The withdrawal agreement bill will fall on the dissolution of the UK Parliament. If a withdrawal agreement bill were reintroduced, the Standing Orders of the Scottish Parliament would require us to lodge a further legislative consent memorandum in respect of that bill. But until the provisions of a withdrawal agreement bill, and in this context, the most important provisions would be those that relate to the implementation period, until the provisions of a withdrawal agreement bill are law, the legislative work that the committees of the Scottish Parliament, the UK Parliament are doing is to prepare for the possibility of continuity of law under the EU Withdrawal Act on exit day.
That's helpful, because I understand from a civil service point of view that that's right, but there is a political dimension overlaying this, which is what I'm more concerned with, because would it not be politically sensible to pause our position until we know, after all, it's only 6 weeks away, till we know what the likelihood is going to be at Westminster, because if we don't pause it, then we could be involved in quite a bit of subordinate legislation, and it might not turn out to be, again, I say I'm the eternal optimist, totally unnecessary.
I have some sympathy with the position you're taking, I have to say. An enormous amount of time and effort has gone into the subordinate legislation programme. We've had to, at one stage, we had to draw in drafters from elsewhere. As you know, committees have had their timetables disrupted. I'm just concerned, and the point that Luke makes is a very important one. This is to prepare for the hopefully non-existent no deal. And if we were not to be fully prepared for that and a no deal happened, for example, at the end of January, we would be scrabbling around in January to try and finish that work. So my own view at the moment is that we should continue with that work and get it finished. But I'm not unsympathetic. And if committees were saying, good gracious me, here's 3 more things we have to do before Christmas, then I think we would sit down and talk to them about it, and to see what we could do. The legislative consent memorandum, when the bill falls, it falls. So we just go back to it. And that, of course, affects other things, areas that you've shown a particularly strong interest in terms of agriculture and regulations for agricultural payments and all the rest of it. This is no way for the UK government to run a country, but I think we have to be ready for any eventuality.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You finished now?
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, there's been substantial discussion about Northern Ireland throughout the latter stages of this process. If there had been substantial discussions about Northern Ireland, perhaps before the referendum, we would have been in a very different place. But obviously the final withdrawal deal as negotiated by the UK government puts Northern Ireland in a particular set of circumstances. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the work the Scottish government's done on what that deal, if agreed, what impact that would have on the economic relationship between Scotland and Northern Ireland.
We are looking at that very closely, and I would hope to bring forward some information on that as soon as I possibly can. We do know the UK government has done no such work, and did no such work in the run-up to the agreement. And I've actually asked that question directly of the UK government and not had a satisfactory answer. So we will bring forward information on that. I think that the issue falls into 3 parts in terms of advantage. And I start by making it very clear, we are not in any way arguing that that should not happen. Absolutely not. It is necessary for it to happen. What we're arguing, and we're not even arguing that if it happens there, it has to happen here. We're simply arguing you cannot envisage a situation in which it happens there and Scotland is disadvantaged by it happening there. And others will argue the case. I mean, I've heard cogent arguments from English politicians who say, well, if Northern Ireland can have these advantages, why would they be denied to England, given the inevitability of economic decline? But there's really essentially 3 parts to this. The first part is the pure economic disadvantage. If you are intending to do something, to invest in something, would you rather invest in Northern Ireland or would you invest in Scotland? And presently we believe, from what we can see, that the decision would be weighted towards Northern Ireland, given the advantages of Northern Ireland, particularly if you wanted to work in the EU or to take advantage of single market conditions. And there are some additional worries in that in terms of fishing and agriculture. The second one is the impact on Scotland in terms of infrastructure and customs proceedings. If you look down in the southwest, there will have to be an increase in checks. Those checks are not even simple checks, because there will be 2 types of checks. There will be a check, well, actually 4 types of checks going each ways. Goods going to Northern Ireland, goods going to the Republic, and goods coming from the Republic and coming from Northern Ireland, and for the Republic, say the rest of the EU via the Republic. Those would all have to be subject to some level of check. Whereas at the present moment, whilst there are occasional security checks, there are no customs checks of that sort. So that is a big issue, and it will continue to be a big issue and will have to be dealt with as a big issue. And the third element, this is democratic. If this is arranged for Northern Ireland, and the Parliament of Northern Ireland, if it comes back, which one assumes it will at some stage, has to make a decision on this. Not only a decision, but is in a calendar of decision-making, every 4 years or every 8 years. Why is there no democratic element in this for Scotland? As I pointed out yesterday, Scotland rejected leaving the EU by a bigger margin than Northern Ireland did. And it seems very inconsistent. So we'll deal with all those three, and we've published some information on some of them. We'll continue to publish that information. But absolutely in the context, to make the point again, we're not saying don't do this. We're saying Scotland really cannot be put at a disadvantage.
Thank you. You mentioned the infrastructure at ports. I mean, my understanding is the geographical reality at Cairnryan in particular massively restricts the ability to add substantial extra infrastructure there. So there's a huge and acute challenge. I presume that's part of the work that the Scottish Government will be doing.
I did in our no-deal plan, as you know. It was in there. I noted the irony in the local papers. I'm sure the convener noted this in the South West. The irony in the local papers of the principal objector to this was the Secretary of State for Scotland, who is the local MP, despite the fact that he is willing Brexit upon a country and a constituency that did not want it. Then he was doing a wonderful NIMBY act immediately afterwards. So, that should not be lost on anybody. But the reality is it's a very difficult set of circumstances. The infrastructure is constrained, and the road system is constrained. But we will have to find ways for that to operate.
Thank you. And sorry. You mentioned the no-deal scenario planning, where we're going to have the lorry park down the road, essentially, from Cairnryan. I presume that's something that, in a similar vein to the way that the UK government's no-deal planning is partially suspended, that this is something that you would look to revisit, presumably later in December into January.
Yes, I mean, it needs to remain live, but, it doesn't have to be implemented, but it needs to remain live. I mean, the status of the no-deal planning work that was done is that remains live, it remains available to us, it can be enacted very quickly and moved into an operational phase very quickly, but clearly that won't happen at the present moment because there's an election on.
Thanks. And just to jump back from no deal to the deal as proposed at the moment, and the further work that you've just mentioned that you're doing, just to confirm, assuming that we are still working towards the January 31st date, I presume the Scottish Government's aim would be to publish as much as possible before Christmas and certainly before January 31st.
Within the confines of PERDA,
yeah.
We will endeavour to do things, but this complicates things even further, It is a baffling matrix of issues that come in here. But, we will endeavour to do as much as we can, but these restrictions will kick in shortly.
Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Turning back to a remark you made in response to earlier questioning, you made the point that even if withdrawal bill in the same or slightly different form returns after the Westminster election to the House of Commons and proceeds, that would nonetheless not mean that Brexit will be done, that Brexit is far from being done. Could you elaborate on that point, please?
Yes, I mean, the "Get It Done" slogan is preposterous. I mean, because it's immensely dishonest. It plays upon the enormous weariness that people have of Brexit, which I have too. I mean, goodness gracious me, why wouldn't I have it after 3 and a bit years, And it says to people there's a magical solution that we can wipe this away, in the sense that I believe there's now a television channel which does not carry Brexit news. You simply say it's going to be done, you put your cross in this box on the 12th of December and it's all over. It's nonsense. It's preposterous nonsense. If Brexit continues, all that happens is you move from one phase of Brexit to another phase of Brexit. Moreover, you move from one phase of Brexit that was meant to be the easy one into the one that's meant to be immensely more complicated, to a factor of 10 or 15 I've heard described. And it's the one that it actually affects most of everyone's everyday life, because it's to do with the minutiae of the trading arrangements, it's to do with the institutions, it's to do with the whole pattern of the future relationship and how that works. And, this will be endless. And it's not been done before. You know, a trading agreement has been entered into, but a trading agreement entered into by an ex-member, you know, has never been entered into. There is a curious remark sometimes made about the Swiss relationship with the EU, which is a treaty-based relationship and very, very complicated, that a third of the Swiss civil service are in the air at any one time because they're on their way to Brussels or on their way back from Brussels. And, you know, you will have a set of circumstances here where the resources of the civil service, which have been utterly absorbed by Brexit in London. I mean, anybody who has had anything to do with the UK government in the last 2 or 3 years knows that it has been a black hole that has sucked in all the other work, all the energy, all the resources sucked into Brexit. Well, that's just going to get bigger. The hole is going to grow, and that more time and effort will be absorbed in this from every single department. So the regrettable thing about this, and it is regrettable, is that people are going to wake up to this pretty early on in the new year, if this happens, and realise that they have been sold a pup. Not even as nice as being sold a pup. This is just going to be a horrific experience. And we need to say that to people. This isn't getting it done. The only way to get Brexit done is to stop Brexit, to say this was absolutely daft, it cannot work, and, crucially, Scotland did not vote for it.
Yes, well, I entirely agree with that, Cabinet Secretary. Looking to the proposals that the UK Prime Minister has on the table, as we speak anyway, at this particular moment in time, proposals that both the Tories north and south of the border support, what is envisaged, it appears, is a much more distant relationship with the EU than even Theresa May had proposed, and particularly with regard to, for example, the regulatory alignment issues crucial to those who trade with the European Union and Scotland. So in the previous text, I understand that there was a suggestion of at least some areas of alignment via a common rule book. That is not the case in the current text. Now, I am the constituency MSP for Cowdenbeath. I represent Rosyth. The Cabinet Secretary will be well aware that in Rosyth, Maui has a major centre of operations, over 600 workers employed in their salmon processing plant, many of whom are EU nationals. And of course, there must be a considerable worry on the part of Maui, the Scottish salmon industry, the general food and drink sector in Scotland, as to what on earth is foreseen to happen. I mean, obviously no deal is catastrophic, but even leaving no deal to one side, in terms of issues about certification, about transportation, what can be said to these economic operators at this time to give them any comfort? And what is the UK government saying to give them any comfort?
Well, on the certification issue, it's a very important one, the food certification issue. Inevitably, if you're not part of the EU, the requirements upon you for certification become more onerous. You know, if you're in the single market, then the requirements are minimal because you all have the same standards, you all operate the same standards. Those standards are enforceable in law. That's really important. You know, the standards are enforceable through the European Court of Justice, so you can trust what's happening. The moment you're outside, then there's no enforceability of the common standard. So the EU will be much tougher about ensuring that their standards are met, and that requires a rigorous programme of inspection. I know from the aquaculture sector in my own constituency, which is important and processing is important in my constituency too, the number of certificates will go up by a factor of between 10 and 100. And it's a very vague thing, but it will be a massive increase in the number of certificates. And there simply aren't the officials able to do that. Now, this is one of the areas where we've worked very hard to try and find some solutions. There is a proposal to centralise certain functions. The UK government did give us, eventually, some money to move forward on trying to get this to work for no deal. This needs to be kept on the agenda for no deal. But even with a deal, it's going to be difficult to cope with. So you need to then, on the wider canvas, remember that regulatory alignment is more important even than tariffs, because regulatory alignment allows the free passage of goods in a way that tariffs are to some extent 19th century barriers. Regulatory alignment takes away 20th and 21st century barriers, and the failure to have regulatory alignment will have an impact. So you have those difficulties within the relationship, And the relationship, if it is a free trade relationship along the lines of a Canada minus or something like that, then clearly there are very, very obvious boundaries to it. I would commend you to a step chart, which I think we've published more than once in documents in which you will have seen, that actually indicates the type of agreement and relationship with the EU that you can have depending on the red lines you bring to the table. And the Canadian one is right down at the far end. I mean, it's almost off the chart. You know, there are a range of other relationships you can have which were on offer. You know, if you honestly believed that leaving the EU was something you wanted to do, and Scotland, of course, did not. But if you believe that, there were a range of other options available. For example, the debate in 2016 at no time said that the way to do this was to leave the single market and the customs union. Quite the reverse. You know, even the lead proponents in that campaign were saying there would be no need to leave the single market. So as you go down the step chart, you realise the disadvantages, and we're right down the step chart, and that will be obvious in every business.
Yes, it's really very worrying indeed, and it's really unacceptable that the UK government has not seen fit to offer any kind of indication about non-tariff barriers, particularly as far as Scotland's food exports are concerned, hugely important to Scotland's economy. Lastly, if I may pick up on a point that was alluded to earlier that was raised by you in your paper published yesterday, Scotland's Place in Europe, Our Assessment of the Revised Withdrawal Agreement and Political Declaration. And you conclude or cite conclusions to the effect that under this basic trade agreement that is envisaged by the UK Prime Minister and the Tory party, the impact on Scottish GDP is estimated to be 6.1% lower within 10 years as compared to staying in the EU. Could you expand on the basis for that conclusion?
It's not, in a sense, not a surprising conclusion, because we've done, as you know, a lot of work on the comparative impact from going from membership into a single market and customs union option, then into the May deal, and then into the so-called WTO option, which is the no deal option. And they all get progressively worse. And the estimate we make is this is broadly just slightly worse than the May deal. Interesting confirmation, essentially, from the National Institute for Economic and Social Research yesterday, who were estimating a £70 billion hit within the 10-year period. So there's broad confirmation that is around where it would lie. Of course, that does not take fully into account, I take Mr Greer's point about Northern Ireland again, that does not take fully into account the impact of Northern Ireland, which still has to be assessed. So one could say that the £3 billion might be a best estimate, you know, and there would still be impact to be had. You know, and can you mitigate that? Well, you know, there may be ways that some companies can mitigate things, but there may be other things that we are not taken into account because there are unexpected consequences of this. You know, some companies have been very clear they're not going to get involved in a public debate about this, but they think there may be consequences. Those people who are involved in just-in-time manufacture, for example, you know, are very doubtful that they can make the type of arrangements in here work. There are Scottish food and drink companies who, you know, are worried, and of course the impact on agriculture is very difficult to quantify, you know, because the sectors are different, but the sectors are already showing signs of strain, and I think that's where you will see, for many of us in our constituencies, you will see severe damage done.
Well, thank you. Very depressing, and it's clear that in terms of the original vote, when 62% of people in Scotland voted to remain, they did so for very good reasons indeed. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just ask a question about legal effect? It's maybe one for your officials. But am I right in thinking that the provisions of the withdrawal agreement must be given direct effect in the UK? Is that right?
Yes, there are parts of the withdrawal agreement that must be given direct effect in the UK. That would be achieved in the withdrawal agreement bill through a combination of clauses 1 and 2, which provide for the implementation period, and clause 5, which effectively has two purposes. The first is to wash up the rest of the withdrawal agreement and transpose it into law, and the second is to give it the status that the withdrawal agreement requires, which is effectively the same status as EU law presently has in the UK's legal systems. You can see that from the words the parliamentary draftsmen have used in Clause 5, which are effectively identical to the words used to give EU law its current status in the legal systems in the 1972 Act.
And I'm right in thinking that also the withdrawal agreement will benefit from the doctrine of the supremacy of EU law?
To the extent that that is provided for by the withdrawal agreement bill, were that bill to become law.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Kevin, I've got a question about the delegated powers issue, but I know that Stuart Macmillan is also going to ask about that, so it may be better for me to wait until he has done that and come back afterwards.
Okay,
That's all right.
it's very polite. Yes, Stuart, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. I'll deal with the delegated powers one first then. After what you said earlier on, Cabinet Secretary, does that then mean that there will still be more delegated powers coming forward over the course of the election period and beyond?
I wouldn't think during the course of the election period, because unless, I mean, the UK Parliament dissolves on Wednesday.
Yes.
I mean, after Wednesday, then there's not going to be anything coming forward. If they can rush them through by Wednesday, I don't know, but I think their focus is on other things. I think what we've got is more or less what we're getting. We have the experience now of this over the last 12 months or so, and things pop up that you're not expecting. You know, suddenly you'll get a letter. One of my colleagues will get a letter from a UK minister that says, we've forgotten about this one. Could you rush this through in the next few weeks? And we've had to be pretty firm about those. And also, to be fair, the committees have been very helpful on those. But I don't think, and you know, I might be proved wrong, but I don't think we're going to see much, if anything, between now and Wednesday. And if there's not anything between now and Wednesday, then there won't be anything until Parliament comes back. And if Parliament comes back the week before Christmas, I don't suppose it'll be doing much. So I suppose we'll be talking about January before there's anything new.
So, if that being the case, then, so it then means that January will be fairly busy in terms of the delegated powers for the committees in this Parliament as well.
Well,
up to the end of January.
I wouldn't necessarily say so, because what we've done, we've done. You know, so we're prepared for a no deal. I mean, there's some work still going on, and Mr. Rumbles is right, but we are prepared for that. The pressure in January would be on the withdrawal agreement bill. I presume that they would endeavour to get that through in 5 days or something. So we would have to come back with our legislative consent memorandum. I have made a commitment to have the Chamber debate that, but I know the Finance and Constitution Committee would want to look at it too. So we would have to make sure that our timetable allowed that to happen. I think I'm right in saying, though Luke will correct me as he often does if I'm wrong, that the legislative consent motion we wouldn't table one, but if we did, it would have to be for the last amending stage of the bill.
Yeah, it's typical to try and have the Parliament express its views before the last amending stage of a UK bill, in order that changes can be made to the UK bill to reflect the views of the devolved legislatures.
And that would be the committee stage in the Lords?
Yes.
Right. So that is essential in terms
report
of
stage.
report stage in the Lords. That's where we would get to in terms of our involvement. So if they were going to do the bill in a week or 10 days, then I think we would try and do it at the earliest opportunity in that time, allowing the committee to have an opportunity to take evidence on it and then to have a debate. If the bill is the same as it is now, then we will bring forward a legislative consent memorandum, but we would not bring forward a legislative consent motion, and we would ask the Parliament to approve that decision.
In a different area, in the document that was published yesterday, the Scotland's Place in Europe, on page 22, there's a table regarding the workforce, EU nationals and non-EU nationals, at the end of paragraph 48. Now, in that table, I would suggest to any reader that it's actually quite a sobering set of statistics regarding the reduction in workforce that we actually have. And I was bearing in mind Scotland's population is an ageing population, so it's clear that we actually need to have more people come in, we need to have more immigration, people come in to actually work and contribute. And I think the third aspect of this chart, where it indicates that the employment rate for the 16 to 64 years was the highest in EU nationals, which clearly that, I would suggest, contradicts any of the obscene narrative that's out there in society that indicates that EU nationals just come here and sit on the dole and take all the money.
we know that EU nationals and migrants in general contribute more per head than others, in terms of tax paid and contribution. We can see the work rate of EU nationals is very substantial. And you're right about those leaving. This is a very worrying statistic. I mean, I represent the Highlands and Islands constituency. Mr Cameron is a Highlands and Islands list MSP. In the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, there is no natural growth of population. I've said this before, to put it bluntly, we're not breeding. In those circumstances, we need people to come in. If they don't come in, the population falls. There's an ageing population in the Highlands and Islands, so the workforce falls, estimated to fall about 20% in the next 10 years with demography. If we don't have a net increase coming through freedom of movement, then we suffer. All our services suffer, because depopulation leads to decline in services. And that is true across Scotland, but particularly true in rural Scotland. If people in the committee have not looked at the map we published online 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think 3 weeks ago, which covers 7,000 data zones in Scotland, you can see the impact of Brexit on each of those data zones. Argyll and Bute, my own constituency, is the 3rd worst affected in Scotland. In fact, if you take out Helensburgh and Lomond, which I don't represent, it's probably the worst affected in Scotland. But all of rural Scotland is badly affected, but urban Scotland is badly affected too. And we need freedom of movement. No ifs, no buts.
And the final point is just regarding the issue of trade. And I had a discussion with a couple of organisations within the last few weeks. And I'd be grateful to know if the Scottish Government are in dialogue, regular dialogue with our airports, and also with the other ports, notwithstanding the ports down that covers Northern Ireland, but the other ports in Scotland, to see if there's a way of more freight being shipped directly from Scotland as compared to going to be sitting at a car park in Kent. And potentially, obviously, some of that food being rotten before it gets to market.
Part of our deal preparations were to examine that. We will continue to examine that. I know officials are in regular contact with the ports and airports. The issue of a no deal is not just what comes in. The issue, as you rightly say, is what goes out. And arrangements were being made. Now, food was not a Category 1 in the UK categorisation for no deal. Medicines were Category 1. But there were arrangements being made to use capacity, outward capacity, that could take food and could take food exports. And there were arrangements being made also for fish and seafood products to be centralised in that. So there was some possibility, but it would be nothing like what the free movement allowed to happen. But of course, we're always mindful of that and will continue to be so.
Just my final question, just that there are 3 new subcommittees at the UK government level, the EU exit strategy, the EU exit economy and trade, and the EU exit operations. Are Scottish government ministers attending any of these particular committee meetings?
We have been, on occasion, part of the daily meeting, which is called, which one is it? XO. We've been daily part of XO, but only by invitation. Their invitation when Michael Gove thinks it's relevant. Now, we know, there must have been over 60 of those. I think we've only been involved in about 12 to 14 of those. And we know some of those meetings have discussed matters which are relevant to devolved competence. So it's not been even as unsatisfactory as its predecessor. There was a committee under David Liddington, which the Prime Minister chaired from time to time, which met in London, not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. I went to that on a number of occasions. John Swinney went to it. The First Minister went to it. And that was a more regular engagement. This one has been grace and favour. And it's been down. And actually, this has not been a disadvantage in terms of technology. It's been done down the line because it's been a daily meeting.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Donald Cameron, did you want to come back in?
Yes, please, Convener, if that's all right. One of the themes in the bill as drafted is that a lot of the powers are left to the executive, if I could say, over the legislature, and that applies to UK government and Scottish government, and in both reserved and devolved areas. Is that something that the government is acutely aware of? I'm sure it is, but as veterans of the Continuity Bill, the Cabinet Secretary will recall that these are often very controversial aspects of the legislation. And I just wonder if you could give a broad observation, if you can.
Yeah, it's a good point, because we have been nervous about the Henry VIII powers, as they're called. We feel that we can understand why they're necessary if you're going to legislate in this way. We rather that the UK government did not legislate in this way, but if you are going to legislate in this way, we can understand why they would want to have them in there. I made a commitment, I certainly think to the Finance and Constitution Committee, I may well have made it to this committee too, that we would make sure that any exercise of those powers by Scottish ministers, because some such powers are given to Scottish ministers to parallel powers of UK ministers, were exercised under full committee scrutiny and parliamentary scrutiny. And I give that commitment again. I would not want us to exercise them in any way other than that. Now, we are veterans of the Continuity Bill. We know how difficult it is to make these things up as you go along, but we need to find it. And we got a protocol with the Scottish Parliament about scrutiny, which I'm happy would continue in place and indeed could be developed further if these powers eventually came into being. If I may extend that just slightly, I am as concerned about the proposal that exists within the bill and the powers of the Joint Committee, because it seems to me that that is where there will be very major power held, and there's no provision made for devolved administration engagement and involvement in the Joint Committee.
That was going to be my next subject, which is the Joint Committee, because as I understand it, the Joint Committee is co-chaired by a UK and an EU representative, but it has a number of sort of subcommittees or specialised committees underneath it. I mean, in terms of the involvement of devolved administrations, what would be your best case scenario? Would you want to be on one of these subcommittees? Would you see there being a role for a kind of?
I think you have to start with the principle that there should be no discussion or decision on matters, and I would put both together. No discussion or decision on matters of devolved competence without the presence and involvement of a devolved minister and the involvement of the devolved parliament. That simply should not happen. There is a further area which is reserve matters which have an impact on devolved matters. For example, migration is one of those areas. EU residence was one of those areas where there should be the presence of devolved ministers and there should be joint decision-making. Remember, the committee, the JMC-EN's terms of reference include the word oversight. And therefore, there's already an arrangement on paper for oversight of all these activities. That does not take place. There is no oversight. I frequently say it at JMCs that, David Barnes has heard me say this at the last one, that in actual fact, you would learn as much reading the newspapers or watching the BBC as you would learn from going to the JMC-EN. So the principle is we must be involved where things for which we are responsible are being decided on, and we must be decision makers in those matters, because that is what the devolved settlement says.
Thank you for that. On a totally different matter, is it right that the Withdrawal Agreement Bill protects geographical indications in Article 54.2?
The Withdrawal Agreement Bill, in terms, is effectively neutral as to quite a lot of the content of the Withdrawal Agreement. It either, as you've already mentioned, provides for powers to make the appropriate changes to law in order to implement the Withdrawal Agreement, or it points to the Withdrawal Agreement and transposes its provisions into law.
Sorry, that was my mistake. I was talking about the Withdrawal Agreement rather than the bill. The Withdrawal Agreement, we are advised, protects geographical indications as they are protected in EU law on the last day of the transition period, and will continue to.
Yeah, under Article 54.2 of the bill, absolutely, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just to kind of wrap up, the committee is also advised by Professor Tobias Locke, who has done some sterling work for us going through the explanatory notes for the Withdrawal Agreement Bill and comparing them to the Scottish Government's legislative consent memorandum and outlining the areas which the UK Government believes require legislative consent and which the Scottish Government believes require legislative consent. Now, Professor Locke has identified 10 areas where the Scottish Government believes that legislative consent is required and the UK Government disagrees. And I just wondered, and that's obviously the bill will fall with Parliament, but if it does come back, how serious do you think that disagreement is, and how do you think that we can overcome it in those 10 areas?
It's not uncommon to have this disagreement, but we think it is serious because we are convinced, I think there are 10 areas, further areas where we believe it is required. We will make that clear. I think we do make part of that clear in the legislative consent memorandum, and we'll make it clear whether or not we agree to consent in those areas. I wouldn't hold your breath for that answer because I think you know the answer already. But if you remember, we had this type of dispute over the issue of frameworks and what were essentially competences, intersecting competences between Scottish competences and EU competences, and there were a number of areas in which there were disagreements on this, and we eventually honed it down to, of the last list of 24, which are the 24 areas of frameworks, I think there were only 2 which we failed to agree. But it does point up another major weakness in the devolved system. Under the current intergovernmental arrangements, the judge and jury in this is the UK Government, not the Scottish Government. We can say till we're blue in our face what we think the situation is. In the end, there is no mechanism for saying we need somebody else to make that decision. Let us put it to arbitration. Let us have independent advice. It simply doesn't exist. They are the people who will decide.
Thank you very much. And finally, we don't know the outcome of the election, and obviously you're not going to predict it here today. But it has struck us that it's April since you were last before the committee, and since then, of course, we have had a new Prime Minister, and as I say, we don't know what the outcome of the election is going to be. But is it possible for you to reflect whether your discussions with the UK Government have changed under the new Prime Minister, and if what those changes might be?
Yes, I mean, I think it is fair to say that over the last 3 years it has got progressively worse, and the new administration has been even harder to deal with. Regrettably, because I'd like to have been able to have got into a position where we were able to do so. I tweeted yesterday very briefly a brief tribute to David Lidington, who, for all the fact that we did not agree on things, I had the greatest respect for, and I felt he was hamstrung actually by the Prime Minister rather than, and would have done more had he been able to do more. But it was possible to have a conversation with him and with Damien Green in which we respected each other's positions, but we chose to disagree, and we did disagree. When we started on the process of discussing potential no deals, and I've said this publicly before, the agreement that David Lidington and I came to, and Mark Drakeford came to the same agreement when he was my counterpart in Wales, and then Jeremy Miles now, was that we disagreed profoundly on the politics of this, and we disagreed on Brexit, and we did not want Brexit to happen. But on the detail of no deal, there was no room for the politics in there. We would have to work together so that we were prepared for it. When the new government came in, my own view was no deal was an acceptable outcome to them. It was never an acceptable outcome to David Lidington or others. They wanted to avoid it. It was an acceptable outcome, and they saw it as a political tool which they could use to get their own way. And they also saw it as an opportunity to beat the devolved administrations when they chose to do so, or try to beat them. And we've seen that, particularly from Michael Gove, I have to say, over the last few months. I think that's deeply regrettable, because there's enough that divides us on this. We're profoundly opposed to Brexit, but I think it's simply got worse and will continue to get worse until either there is no Brexit or Scotland is an independent member of the EU.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and can I thank the witnesses for coming to give evidence to us today, and we shall now move into private session. Thank you.